Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I should have known better. Hollow Pines had a reputation, a whispered warning from locals who'd grown up near its edge. The woods aren't right there, the gas station attendant had said with a nervous glance out the window. I laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. A few friends and I had planned this trip for weeks, and nothing was going to ruin our weekend. The first night was perfect. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the towering pines, and the stars were so bright they looked like they'd been painted on the sky. There was a comforting stillness, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. We shared ghost stories and roasted marshmallows, our laughter echoing into the night. But then it started, the howling. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. Not a wolf, not a coyote. It was deeper, rougher, and disturbingly human. A long, guttural wail that made my skin crawl. Coyotes, Jake said, his voice too casual, too forced. He leaned back, poking the fire with a stick. They're harmless. Coyotes don't sound like that, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the dark tree-line. None of us slept much that night. The howling didn't last long, but once it faded, the silence was worse. It was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. By morning, the unease had faded, replaced by the usual excitement of a camping trip. We hiked to a nearby lake, swam in the icy water, and forgot about the strange sounds. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt warm and safe, and I started to think we'd just let our imaginations get the better of us. That night, the howling came again. This time, it was closer, too close. The sound wove in and out of the trees, circling our campsite like a predator stalking its prey. The firelight felt like a fragile barrier between us and whatever was out there. Maybe we should leave, Sarah said, clutching her blanket tightly around her shoulders. Jake shook his head. We're fine. Probably just some stray dogs or something. They'll move on. But I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, purposeful, as if it was calling to us or warning us. I hardly slept that night. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept staring out of the tent, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. On the third day, we found tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Large, clawed, but with a strange, almost human shape to them. They led away from our campsite and disappeared into the denser part of the forest. We should go, I said. Jake laughed. You're being ridiculous. It's just a bear. Bears don't leave tracks like that, Sarah snapped. But Jake was stubborn, and none of us wanted to argue. We stayed. That night, the howling wasn't just close, it was right outside our campsite. It started as one long, mournful wail, but then others joined in, creating an eerie symphony that sent chills down my spine. We huddled together by the fire, clutching whatever we could use as weapons. Knives, branches, anything. When the first shape emerged from the shadows, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its head tilted as if it were studying us, and its eyes, God, its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. Then another stepped out, and another. There were at least 5 of them, surrounding us, their twisted bodies casting grotesque shadows on the trees. They didn't speak, didn't growl or snarl. They just stared, their heads twitching unnaturally from side to side. "Stay back," Jake shouted, waving a burning stick. The creatures didn't flinch. They didn't seem afraid of the fire, or us. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. One moment they were there, and the next, the shadows swallowed them whole. But the howling continued. It echoed through the trees, moving further and further away, until it was just a faint whisper in the distance. We didn't sleep. As soon as the sun began to rise, we packed up and left, abandoning half our gear in our rush to get out of those cursed woods. I've tried to forget what happened at Hollow Pines, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that howling again, faint and far away. I don't know what we saw out there, and I don't want to know. But one thing is certain. Whatever lives in Hollow Pines isn't human. And it isn't alone. Story 2. It started as a perfect camping trip. The air was crisp, the kind of clean that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. We were 5 friends, Nick, Sarah, Danny, Tom, and me, the usual crew. We'd done this trip a few times before, venturing into the woods for some much-needed escape. This time, we picked a spot deep in Blackwater Forest, a place Danny found online. Unspoiled and serene, she called it. By the second night, I wished we'd chosen somewhere else. The trouble began after we settled in for the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the woods had fallen silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, suffocating kind, like the forest was holding its breath. I was in my tent, zipped up in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows the moonlight cast on the thin fabric. Nick snored softly in his tent a few feet away. Sarah and Danny were whispering about something in theirs, giggling like school kids. That's when I saw it, the shadow. It moved across my tent, tall and angular. At first, I thought it was Tom playing a prank. He had a thing for scaring us, and he knew I wasn't a fan of the dark. But this shadow wasn't right. It was too tall, easily 8 feet, and its limbs were oddly long, bending at unnatural angles. "Tom," I called out softly, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The shadow paused, then moved again, slower this time, as if it was circling my tent. I stayed frozen, clutching the edge of my sleeping bag. "Nick? Sarah?" I tried again, louder now, hoping someone would respond. Still nothing. Then the scratching began. Long, deliberate strokes against the fabric of my tent. It started at the base, near my feet, and moved upward in a slow, measured line. The sound was excruciating, a dry, scraping noise that made my teeth ache. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. I wanted to unzip the tent and bolt to the others, but fear rooted me in place. My heart pounded so loud, I was sure it could hear me. The scratching stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and ragged. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then the tent sagged inward, as if something was pressing its weight against it. That broke me. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag and grabbed the zipper, yanking it down in one frantic motion. Cold air rushed in, and I half expected to see some monstrous figure looming outside. But there was nothing, just the woods, bathed in silvery moonlight. My breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as I stepped out, clutching the flashlight I'd grabbed. I swept the beam around, searching for any sign of movement. Guys, my voice was shaky now, barely audible. No one answered. I turned back to my tent, and that's when I saw them. The claw marks. 4 long, jagged streaks ran down the side of the tent, cutting deep into the fabric. They were precise, almost too perfect, like they'd been made with purpose. My stomach churned. "Hey, what's going on?" Nick's voice came from behind me, startling me so badly I dropped the flashlight. I spun around to see him, his face a mix of confusion and grogginess. Sarah and Danny stumbled out of their tent, followed by Tom, all of them looking disheveled and annoyed. "There was something," I stammered, pointing to the tent. They crowded around to see the claw marks, their expressions shifting from annoyance to unease. "What the hell did this?" Tom muttered, running his fingers over the gashes. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it was outside my tent, and it had scratched at it." Nick shook his head. "Probably an animal. A bear, maybe." "No bear I've ever seen is 8 feet tall and moves like that," I shot back. We argued for a while, the tension rising with every passing second. Finally, Danny suggested we move closer together, setting up our tents in a cluster. Safety in numbers, she reasoned. It sounded like a good idea at the time. That night, none of us slept. The scratching came again, louder this time, circling all of our tents. We huddled together in the center, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find, pocket knives, flashlights, even a frying pan. But we never saw it. Morning came, and the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we dismantled the tents, we found more claw marks. Not just on my tent, but on all of them. As we made our way back to the car, we noticed something else. The trees around the campsite had marks too, long, jagged scratches, like the forest itself had been attacked. We didn't talk much on the drive home. There was nothing to say. I haven't been camping since that trip. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a scratching sound at my window or a shadow crossing the wall. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Whatever was out there in Blackwater Forest, it found me, and it hasn't let go. Story 3. Camping wasn't my idea. I want to make that clear. My buddies, Greg and Tom, had planned the whole trip weeks in advance, insisting we needed to unplug and get in touch with nature. Me? I was fine staying plugged in, where the biggest threat was a low battery. But there I was, trudging through the dense forest of Blackridge pines with a pack strapped to my back and sweat trickling down my spine. The air smelled like moss and damp earth, and the trail was quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant rustle of leaves. We'd spent 2 days hiking, setting up camp, and laughing around a fire like we were teenagers again. It wasn't bad. Peaceful, even. But on the third day, everything went wrong. We were supposed to hike back to the car that morning. Greg, the self-proclaimed outdoorsman, took charge of navigation. He had the map in one hand and a smug grin on his face as he led the way. "Piece of cake," he said. "We'll be back by lunch." But an hour later, lunch was the last thing on my mind. The trail markers, the little blue blazes painted on trees, had disappeared. At first, we thought we'd missed one, so we doubled back, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just endless trunks, identical and unmarked. "I swear we passed this tree already," I muttered, pointing to a gnarled oak with a knot that looked like a face. "You're imagining things," Greg snapped, though his voice had lost its confidence. Tom, usually the joker of the group, was unusually quiet. He just kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone or something to be following us. By midday, the forest felt off. It's hard to explain. The air seemed heavier, thicker. The trees, which had been spaced comfortably apart, grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sun. "I don't like this," Tom said finally, breaking his silence. Greg waved him off. "It's just a denser part of the forest. We'll find the trail again. Trust me." But I didn't trust him. The trail didn't vanish for no reason. Trails are made by people, maintained by people. Someone would have noticed if it just disappeared. We kept walking, though. What else could we do? The forest felt endless, like it was swallowing us whole. It was nearly dark when we stumbled upon the campsite. I don't know what we were expecting, a ranger station, maybe, or a clearing where we could get our bearings. Instead, we found this, for tents were arranged in a rough circle, their colors faded and their fabric torn in places. Empty cans and scraps of food littered the ground, but the fire pit was cold, and the air reeked of decay. "Who just leaves their camp like this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom bent down to pick up a rusty can of beans, his nose wrinkling. "This has been here a while. Months, maybe longer." Greg was the first to notice the movement. "Hey, look at that." He pointed to the tents. At first, I thought he was seeing things, but then I saw it too. The fabric of one tent bulged outward, like something inside was pressing against it. "Is someone in there?" Tom asked. "I don't know," Greg replied, taking a step back. "But I'm not sticking around to find out." I should have followed Greg's lead, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello," I called, approaching the nearest tent. The fabric shifted again, almost like it was breathing. My heart pounded as I reached for the zipper. "Don't," Tom hissed, grabbing my arm. But it was too late. I yanked the zipper down, and the flap fell open. Inside was nothing, or so I thought. The stench hit me first, a mix of rot and mildew that made me gag. Then I saw the sleeping bag, unzipped and stained with something dark and crusty. "What the hell happened here?" Greg whispered. Before I could answer, the other tents started moving. All of them. The movement wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something or somethings were crawling around inside. "We need to go," Tom said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rustling tents. I nodded, backing away, but then the forest betrayed us. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching down like claws. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, swallowing what little light remained. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a moan. It came from the tents, but it didn't stay there. It echoed around us, bouncing off the trees, disorienting us. "Run!" Greg shouted, and we bolted. I don't know how long we ran. The forest blurred around us, a maze of black trunks and clawing branches. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, something pale and gaunt flitting between the trees. The growls followed us, growing louder, more insistent. At one point, I tripped and fell, scraping my palms on the rough ground. When I looked up, I saw a face staring back at me. It was pale, eyeless, and stretched into a grin that didn't belong on anything human. I scrambled to my feet and ran faster than I ever thought possible. When we finally broke into a clearing, I thought we were safe. But the clearing wasn't an exit. It was the campsite. We were back. The tents were still there, their fabric bulging and shifting. But now there were more of them, at least a dozen, scattered in a haphazard circle, and the growls were louder than ever. "We're trapped," Tom said, his voice trembling. Greg didn't say anything. He just stared at the tents, his face pale and his hands shaking. That's when the zippers started opening. I won't describe what came out of those tents. I can't. My mind refuses to hold on to the memory, like it's trying to protect me. All I know is that we ran. We didn't stop until the sun rose, and somehow we found the trail again. But Greg didn't make it. One moment he was with us, and the next he was gone. Tom and I never talked about what happened. We never went camping again either. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the sound of zippers being pulled, and I smell that awful stench. And I know that the forest remembers us. Story 4. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. The kind of trip you take to escape the grind of everyday life. To sit around a fire, laugh, and maybe tell a few stories that are more ridiculous than they are scary. But nothing about the old oak in the center of the campground felt peaceful. The campsite was small, tucked away in the middle of Blackwood Forest, a few miles outside the town of Silver Creek. It was one of those places that had that eerie, secluded feeling to it, but not in a way that made you feel immediately uncomfortable. It was more like an old friend who had secrets. The forest had a way of looking back at you when you looked away, but we were all seasoned campers, and we didn't think much of it. At least, not at first. The oak tree at the center of the camp was massive. It had to be hundreds of years old, its bark gnarled and dark, its branches so thick they seemed to scrape the sky. I think it was the first thing that caught my attention when we arrived. The others were busy setting up tents and unloading gear, but I kept looking at that tree. The way it loomed over us, silent and imposing. It felt as though it was watching us, waiting for something. Isn't that thing something? John, one of my friends, had said, noticing me staring at it. You should see it at night, when the moonlight hits it just right. It looks like it's alive. I forced a chuckle and agreed. But I wasn't joking when I said I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a tree. The air around it felt thick, charged. Every time I looked at it, there was something crawling under my skin, something unspoken, something ancient. Still, I didn't let it ruin the trip. After all, it was just a tree, right? That night, We gathered around the campfire. It was a typical camping evening. The fire crackled, casting its warm, flickering light on our faces as we talked about everything and nothing. My friends joked about the forest and how haunted it was, how it looked like the kind of place you'd see in a bad horror movie. We laughed. I laughed too, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then the whispers started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought it was just the wind. But the wind didn't speak. The whispers sounded like words, but the words were too quiet, too far away to make out. I glanced around at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. They were all absorbed in the stories they were telling, their voices louder than the strange sounds coming from the direction of the oak. I tried to brush it off, tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder. At first, it sounded like a child, murmuring softly under their breath. Then, it became a steady hum, a low vibration that seemed to reverberate in my chest. My hands began to sweat, my heartbeat picking up in my chest. The air around the fire seemed to get colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, curling toward the tree. I had to get up. I didn't want to, but something was pulling me toward the oak. It was as though it was calling me, beckoning me to come closer. Slowly, I stood, my legs stiff and heavy as I walked away from the firelight. The others didn't notice, too caught up in their own voices, too busy laughing to hear the whispering that was now unmistakable. I approached the tree, its massive trunk towering over me like a sentinel, its limbs creaking in the wind. The whispers were clearer now, a chorus of voices, low, guttural, and hollow. They seemed to rise from deep within the tree, coming from the roots, the bark, the very air around me. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel them. The words didn't matter. The sensation of being watched, being trapped, was enough. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, my body frozen. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. It was as if the tree had gone silent, waiting for something, waiting for me. And then the ground trembled beneath me. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. The roots, those twisted, gnarled roots that were buried deep in the earth, were shifting. Slowly, like a slow, deliberate breath, they began to break through the surface of the ground. They curled and writhed like serpents, pushing up from the soil, reaching, stretching, as though the tree itself was awakening. I staggered back, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Something held me in place, something unseen and invisible, like a thread tying me to that ancient oak. I felt a pull in my chest, a tug, as if the tree was trying to draw me closer. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my body didn't respond. The roots reached further and further, creeping toward me like living fingers, dragging themselves through the dirt, their tips scraping against the ground with a sound that made my skin crawl. I finally managed to break free from the tree's pull, stumbling back toward the camp, my breath coming in gasps. I couldn't look away from the oak, though. It seemed to loom over me, watching, waiting. When I made it back to the campfire, the whispers stopped, but the air was heavy with something dark. The others were still laughing, oblivious to what I had just witnessed. I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell them. The fear was choking me, knotting up in my throat. I sat down, staring at the fire, my mind racing. What had just happened? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers had returned, this time louder, more insistent. They were right outside my tent. I could hear them clearly now, the voices murmuring in a language that didn't belong to any human tongue. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to penetrate everything. The tree was calling again. This time it wasn't just whispers. It was a voice, a deep, ancient voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but I was frozen. I couldn't tear myself away from the tree, even though it was calling me with an undeniable force. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the roots reaching, dragging themselves toward our tents. The next morning, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I went to check on the tree, half expecting to see the same twisted roots crawling across the ground. But there was nothing. No sign of a disturbance. It was as if the night had never happened. The oak stood there, silent and still, as though it had never whispered at all. But I knew better. I could feel it. I could feel the change in the air. And as I packed up my gear and left the campsite, I couldn't help but look back at the tree one last time. The branches seemed to stretch toward me, reaching out, beckoning me to come back. And I swear, I heard it, just faintly, a whisper, and then silence. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. Story 5. We've been looking forward to this camping trip for months. There was something calming about the idea of getting away from it all. No phones, no emails, just the wilderness and our group of friends. The lake was supposed to be the highlight of the trip. It was small but clear, nestled between towering pines, far enough from the nearest town to feel like a true escape. But the night changed everything. It was the second evening when the strange lights appeared. We'd settled into our campsite by the edge of the lake. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving the sky streaked with purples and oranges. The air had a bite to it, cool enough to make us pull on jackets, but not cold enough for a fire yet. We were laughing, teasing each other, and getting our gear set up for the night, when I noticed it, a faint glow over the water. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe some campers on the other side had a lantern, or maybe it was the moon reflecting off the surface. But no, the glow wasn't steady. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Hey, look at that, I called to my friends, pointing toward the lake. They turned, following my finger. At first, no one said anything. We all stared at the lights in silence. They were too far away to tell what they were. It almost looked like fireflies, but they moved too erratically. 1 minute, they were low to the water, and the next, they were high up in the air, then back down again, moving in a strange, almost deliberate pattern. Maybe it's just some weird natural thing, Sarah suggested. Bioluminescent algae or something. Yeah, right, Jason snorted. Like that happens out here. You ever seen anything like that in the movies? We laughed, but I wasn't so sure. The lights didn't feel natural. There was something off about them. They didn't behave the way anything should, as if they were waiting for us to notice them, or worse, drawing us in. After a while, we all grew quiet. The glow intensified, pulsing like a rhythmic heartbeat. It was hypnotic, drawing me in, I felt an odd pull, as if something in my chest was urging me to get closer, to see it up close. I wasn't the only one. Sarah and Jason both started moving toward the water too. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. It was as if we were all thinking the same thing. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked, but I wasn't entirely sure I wanted the answer. "Come on," Jason said. "It's just lights. Let's check it out." And so we did. We walked down the trail toward the water. The glow seemed to grow brighter with every step, beckoning us like some ancient signal. The air became heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. No birds, no rustling of leaves. Just our footsteps and the occasional splash as we neared the shore. When we reached the edge of the lake, the lights were gone. I felt a pang of disappointment and something deeper, something darker. The air was still too still. The only sound now was the soft lapping of water against the rocks. "Where did they go?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "I don't know," I replied, looking around. The water shimmered faintly in the fading light, but there was nothing else. No sign of the strange lights. But then it happened. At first, I thought I saw something rising out of the water. At first, it was just a ripple, faint and subtle. But then it became clearer, and my blood ran cold. A figure rose from the lake. It wasn't human, not in any way I could comprehend. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, and its limbs, twisted, gnarled, clawed their way upward from the water. Its skin was slick, shimmering in the faint moonlight like something wet and unnatural. It moved slowly, deliberately, and my heart raced in my chest as I watched. "Guys," I breathed, my voice caught in my throat. "What the hell is that?" I could barely hear Sarah or Jason's reply. Either they didn't speak, or the sound of my own heartbeat drowned them out. The thing in the water was monstrous. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, and it hung from its bones like a stretched out shadow of a person. I could see every rib, every joint, and the way its limbs twisted unnaturally. It was like nothing that belonged in this world. And then I saw its eyes. They glowed, not with the soft pulse of the lights, but with an intense, unnatural radiance. Two orbs of yellow light, so bright they hurt to look at. It stared at us. No, into us, as if it was feeding off our fear. And I realized, too late, that I was no longer just afraid. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. Jason was the first to snap out of it. He yelled, "Run!" But the word was barely out of his mouth when the creature lunged. Its limbs moved with terrifying speed, slashing through the air as if it were one with the water. I didn't think, I didn't question. I ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the campsite, breathless, panting, hearts hammering in our chests. We didn't say anything for a long time. None of us wanted to believe what we'd just seen, but it was there, whatever it was real. We packed up our things that night. We left the lake behind, and we didn't speak a word of it to anyone else. We couldn't. It was too insane, too terrifying to explain. But I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. There's something in that lake. Something waiting for you. Something that's been there for longer than we could imagine. And if you're not careful, If you listen too closely to the call of those lights, you might find yourself staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. And if you do, there's no running from it, because it will rise from the water, and when it does, the darkness will follow you, no matter how far you run. You don't mess with what's in that lake. I know that now, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. Story 6. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway with the guys. A chance to get out of the city, crack open a few beers, and leave all the chaos behind. We had all been friends since high school, and when life pulled us in different directions, it was these trips that kept us together. But the trip to Pine Ridge, deep in the heart of the woods, would end up being the last one we'd ever take together. We set up camp on the first day, each of us pulling our weight. Matt was the one who always took charge, directing us on where to pitch the tents, while Tom and Ben worked on building the fire. I handled the food, and Jeff was the quiet one. He didn't really have a specific role, but he was always there, offering a kind of steady, unspoken presence. It was the same every time. We had our routine, and it worked. By nightfall, the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cool autumn air. The trees around us stood like silent sentinels, their long shadows stretching across the forest floor. The stars above were crystal clear, and the silence of the woods had a calming effect. We talked, we laughed, we reminisced about old times. The kind of conversation that only happens around a campfire, where the past feels closer and the present fades away. That was when he showed up. At first, I thought it was just one of the guys. Maybe Ben or Matt had gone off to take a piss and had returned after a few drinks. But when I turned to look, I froze. There was a man standing at the edge of our campfire light. He was tall, with a thick beard that looked unkempt and wild, and his clothes were ragged, something like old military surplus. But what struck me the most was his face. It wasn't that it was unfamiliar, it was that there was something off about it. His eyes were dark, too dark, and they didn't reflect the light of the fire. He had no expression, no warmth in his gaze. His smile, though, it was wide and unnervingly calm, as if he were trying to be friendly, but didn't know how to do it properly. "Who's this?" Matt asked, squinting through the smoke. We all turned to look, but no one had seen him approach. He just appeared. We had been sitting there for hours, and the only sounds had been the crackle of the fire and the occasional animal scurrying through the underbrush. "Don't know," Jeff said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we didn't invite anyone else." The man didn't answer. He just stood there, grinning like some sort of twisted mascot. His eyes never left us, not once. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, but none of us said anything. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong, like he shouldn't have been there. "Want to sit down?" Tom asked, trying to break the awkward tension. His voice was forced, too casual. It was clear he didn't know what to make of this situation. The stranger nodded, and without saying a word, he moved to sit down. He didn't grab a log like the rest of us. Instead, he simply crouched down on the ground, his back straight, his eyes locked on us like a predator studying its prey. We didn't ask him his name, and he didn't offer one. It was as though he was just there, and so we let it slide. Maybe it was the isolation of the woods, Or maybe it was the silence between us that made us feel like this strange man was part of our group. Maybe we all just didn't want to acknowledge the weirdness. The night stretched on. We drank, talked, and played cards by the fire, all the while the stranger sat silently, watching us with that wide, unsettling smile. The fire burned lower, the flames casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward the man, as if reaching for him. Yet he never moved. As the night wore on, we began to feel a creeping unease, but no one dared to mention it. It was a classic case of don't ask, don't tell, like we were all collectively afraid to break the fragile, uneasy truce that had formed. The stranger, with his silent presence, seemed almost like a ghost, one that existed only in the periphery, never truly interacting, but always there, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the campfire was just a dying ember and the others were stirring. But something was wrong. Matt was missing. It wasn't like him to wander off without telling anyone. We checked around the campsite, calling his name, but there was no answer. The woods had swallowed him up. Where the hell is Matt? Ben asked, panic creeping into his voice. I don't know, I replied, my stomach twisting with unease. He wouldn't just leave. We need to find him, Jeff said, his tone tight with worry. We all agreed, and the four of us started combing the area. We shouted his name, but the woods stayed silent. By the time we had searched for what felt like hours, there was no sign of him. And then, when we returned to camp, we saw something that made my blood run cold. The stranger was still there, sitting exactly where he had been before, smiling that unnerving grin. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't said a word. But now, there was a flicker of realization in my gut. Something was terribly wrong. I looked around at the others, and I saw the same unease mirrored in their eyes. We all knew, without saying it aloud, that Matt was gone. He had disappeared, and we hadn't seen a single trace of him. And the man, the one who didn't belong, was still here, like he was waiting for something. None of us could bring ourselves to ask him what had happened to Matt, but the question was in the air, hanging there like a thick fog. The rest of the night passed in a kind of haze. The stranger stayed with us, never leaving, never speaking. He just watched, and that was enough to send us into a silent, terrified stupor. The fire had almost died out completely by the time we finally retreated into our tents, each of us too shaken to sleep, too afraid to confront whatever it was that lurked just beyond the circle of light. But it wasn't until morning that the true horror hit. Matt was gone. His sleeping bag, his gear, everything was missing, as if he had vanished into thin air. And the stranger? He was still sitting there, right where he had been all night, smiling like he had no care in the world. We packed up in silence, not daring to look back. I don't think any of us said a word as we left Pine Ridge, but we all knew. We all knew that whatever had happened that night, it was connected to the man who didn't belong. As we drove away, I looked back through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching us, that eerie grin still plastered on his face. But there was nothing, just the trees, swaying in the wind like nothing had ever happened. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching, always watching. We never spoke of it again. None of us ever went back to Pine Ridge, and none of us ever mentioned the man who didn't belong. But I know what I saw. We all know. And sometimes, when the air is still and the darkness stretches just a little too far, I feel like that smile is still following me, lurking just at the edge of my mind. Waiting. Story 7. I don't know why we chose to camp in that old forest. Maybe it was the promise of isolation, or the way the trees stood like sentinels, watching over us. There was something serene about it. At first, peaceful, but that was before we heard the bell. I'll start from the beginning. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my girlfriend, Sarah, and our two best friends, Ben and Lisa. We were tired of the city, the noise, and the pressure. So, we packed up our gear and headed for the woods, a spot far from the beaten path. We set up camp at the edge of the forest, near a small clearing where the firelight could dance with the shadows of the trees. The first night went by without incident. We roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and joked about how we were roughing it. The wind whispered through the branches, and the fire crackled like a heartbeat. There was a crispness to the air that made me feel alive, as if the wilderness was pressing against me, reminding me of how small I was in the grand scheme of things. But then, as the night deepened, I began to notice something strange. It started with a faint ringing sound, so distant that I thought I was imagining it. A bell. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the wind or the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, cutting through the quiet like a blade. At first, none of us mentioned it. It was just an odd noise in the woods, nothing to be worried about. But as the hours passed, the ringing persisted, and it began to circle our camp, moving from one side to the other. It wasn't constant. It would stop for a few seconds and then start again, growing louder, closer. The sound had an eerie quality to it, like it was echoing through the trees, and it seemed wrong somehow, unnatural. I tried to brush it off, but the others weren't as easygoing. Sarah was the first to bring it up. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, as if she expected something to step out from the shadows. Ben chuckled nervously. "It's just some animal, probably a squirrel with a bell on it or something." But Lisa wasn't laughing. "That's not an animal," she said, her voice tight. "It's something else." The air felt thick, heavier than it had before. I could feel the tension between us as we sat around the fire, each of us listening to the bell's constant tolling, as if it was a countdown to something we couldn't see. As the minutes ticked by, I noticed something else. It was always the same time when the bell rang, exactly 3:13 a.m. The next night, it happened again, the same ringing at exactly 3:13, just as we were settling in for the night. But this time, it was different. The sound seemed to be closer, sharper, more insistent. It was like someone was standing just outside our camp, ringing the bell in our ears. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. "Okay, that's not right," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Ben, who had been trying to sleep through the whole thing, sat up with a groan. "What the hell is that sound?" "I don't know," I said, my voice tight with unease. "But it's been happening every night at 3:13. We should check it out," Sarah said, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "No way," Ben protested. It's probably just some kids messing around. But something in the air told me it wasn't kids. It felt ancient, cold, like the forest itself was alive and aware of us, its guests. "We need to find out what it is," I said, my voice firm. "Let's follow the sound." We grabbed flashlights, and with our hearts racing, we made our way through the dark forest, the bells ringing, echoing around us. The sound seemed to move in a circle, as though it was playing with us, teasing us with its elusive location. We trudged through the underbrush, each step feeling heavier than the last. My flashlight beam darted over the trees, the ground, the shadows, but all I saw were silhouettes and the faint, flickering glow of firelight in the distance. Then we saw it, up ahead, near an old, gnarled tree. Hanging from a low branch was a rusted bell. It was old, far older than anything that should have been in these woods. The metal was weathered, stained by time and neglect, but it still rang, even though there was no one nearby to strike it. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "That's where the sound is coming from." I stepped closer, drawn to the bell, but something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The bell should have been quiet, still, but it wasn't. It kept ringing, its sound low and mournful, like a death knell. But here's the thing, I couldn't hear it with my ears. Not in the way I should have. The ringing was inside my head. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the bell wasn't just an object. It was a force, a presence that had somehow slipped into my mind. I could feel the ringing vibrating through my skull, rattling my brain, gnawing at my thoughts. It was maddening. The more I focused on it, the louder it grew, until I couldn't hear anything else. It was as if the bell had taken root inside me, spreading its terrible toll throughout my body. I stumbled back, clutching my head. "Make it stop!" I screamed, but no one else seemed to hear me. They were all frozen, their eyes wide, staring at the bell like it was pulling them in. And then the air around us changed. The wind stopped. The trees, which had been swaying gently, fell still. It was as if the whole forest held its breath. The ringing continued, but now it wasn't just in my head. It was in the air, in the very ground beneath my feet. The earth felt alive, pulsing with the sound of that bell. It was as if the forest had grown into something far older and more powerful than anything I could comprehend. The bell's toll grew louder, but it wasn't just the sound anymore. It was reaching into us. I felt it clawing at my mind, trying to pull me into some dark place. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered. I couldn't focus. I couldn't breathe. "Get away from it," Lisa screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. But it was too late. The bell had already taken root in my head, and I could feel it spreading like poison through my veins. And then, in the middle of it all, I heard something else. A voice. Low. Whispering. No, not a voice. 1,000 voices, all murmuring the same thing. "Come closer. Stay forever." I don't know how we got back to camp. I don't remember. But when we did, the bell stopped ringing. The night seemed to go back to normal, though the air was thick with an oppressive silence. No one spoke. We all huddled around the fire, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to move. We left the forest the next morning, packed up, and drove back to the city without a word. We never spoke of it again, but the ringing never stopped. It's in my head always. The bell tolls in the back of my mind at exactly 3:13 a.m. every night. And it won't stop until I return to the forest, until I answer its call. Come closer. Stay forever. Story 8. The moment I stepped in a blackwood forest, I felt something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, or how the sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above. We had been looking for the perfect camping spot, and it seemed like the kind of place that would give us the true wilderness experience. We wanted isolation. We wanted the thrill of being surrounded by nature. But Blackwood, for all its beauty, had a presence that wasn't easy to ignore. There were 5 of us. Me, my cousin Mark, his girlfriend Julia, and our 2 childhood friends, Ben and Sarah. We'd all grown up camping, exploring the woods, but something about this place felt different. Even Ben, the most seasoned of us all, had been unnervingly quiet the moment we arrived. He'd insisted that we stay closer to the main trail, but Mark was eager to venture deeper into the woods, away from the usual crowded campsites. We pitched our tents near a creek, the sound of running water providing a kind of comfort that quickly turned hollow as the day turned to night. We built a fire, cracked open a few beers, and tried to settle in. Julia started talking about ghost stories, and before long, we were all swapping tales of haunted forests, strange happenings in the woods, and eerie noises that couldn't be explained. It was all fun until the wind picked up. It wasn't normal wind either. There was a weight to it, like it was carrying something with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just outside the glow of the fire. The night dragged on, but eventually we all fell asleep, one by one, as the fire burned low. I woke up at some point though. Maybe it was the sound of something moving in the woods, or maybe it was the silence, so thick that it felt like the world had paused. I stared out into the dark, eyes adjusting to the shadows. That's when I saw it, a shape, something just beyond the tree line, watching us. I didn't say anything. I didn't wake anyone. I just lay there frozen, and then I heard it, a low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I waited for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, I felt a little safer, like the day could somehow wash away the fear that had gripped me during the night. We ate breakfast by the fire, though none of us mentioned the strange feeling in the air. That's when we decided to dig a fire pit. The one we'd built the night before wasn't deep enough, and the smoke had been drifting into our tents. Mark, always the optimist, suggested we dig a deeper hole. At first, it felt like a normal task. Nothing to fear. The shovel cut easily through the dirt, and soon we had a sizable pit. But then, the shovel hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a root. It was something solid, metallic. My stomach lurched as I knelt down, brushing away dirt with my hands. Mark joined me, and together we worked to expose the object, which turned out to be an old metal box, its surface rusted and covered in dirt. We stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. "What the hell is this?" Julia whispered. I brushed off more dirt, and Ben, ever the skeptic, reached down to pull it out. The box was heavy, surprisingly so. He placed it on the ground, and we all stared at it for a long moment, the morning sunlight reflecting off its weathered surface. I felt an uneasy curiosity wash over me. There was something about the box, its presence in the forest, buried so deep, like it was waiting for someone to find it. Ben tried to pry it open, but the lock was stiff. It took some effort, but finally it clicked. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents inside. The first thing I saw were the photographs. Dozens of them, stacked neatly in the box. They were old, too old. Black and white, the edges curled with age. My fingers trembled as I picked one up. It was a picture of a group of campers, just like us, smiling as they stood in front of a campfire. But their smiles didn't reach their eyes. In fact, they looked terrified. I looked closer. The expressions were too stiff, too forced. The eyes of the people in the photo were wide. Their teeth gritted as though they were trying to hide something. A secret too horrifying to admit. I pulled out another photograph, then another. Each one was the same. People standing around campfires, their faces contorted in fear, their bodies stiff and unnatural. "Who are these people?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. "But they look wrong." We sat there in silence for a while, turning the photographs over in our hands. The box also contained a small notebook. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded. I started reading aloud, though my voice faltered as I went on. "We found it. The thing in the woods. It's real. It watches. It waits. We shouldn't have come here. It won't let us leave." The words were jumbled, almost as if they had been written in a rush. Whoever had written them had been frantic, terrified. I stopped reading, my throat tight. "We need to put this back," Mark said, his voice shaking. This is not our problem." But as we buried the box again, the unease in the air didn't dissipate. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger, heavier. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the trees. That night, as we sat around the fire, something strange happened. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a whisper in the wind, a faint murmur that seemed to come from all directions. But then it became clearer. Someone or something was calling our names. "Sarah," a voice whispered, echoing through the trees. "Mark, Ben." I froze. It wasn't just the wind. It was distinct, human. It sounded like the voice of someone we knew, but distorted, like they were far away, or worse, like they were in trouble. I turned to the others, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Julia nodded, her face pale. "Who's out there?" "Maybe it's just an animal," Ben suggested, though his voice trembled. But I knew better. I felt it in my bones. The forest was alive with something that didn't belong. We decided to go back to our tents, but no one slept that night. The voices came again, louder this time, and I could swear I heard someone, something, moving just beyond the firelight. At one point, I heard a rustling sound outside my tent, followed by a low growl. I didn't dare open the flap. In the morning, when we gathered around the fire, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The box, the one we had buried. It was back by the fire, sitting in the dirt as though it had never been touched. The photographs were gone. All that was left inside were the faded pages of the notebook. and one last, chilling message. You found us. Now you're part of it. We packed up quickly, our nerves frayed, but I knew, deep down, that the forest had claimed us. It had buried its secrets long ago, and now it had drawn us in, marked us as its own. We left Blackwood Forest that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were still watching, waiting for the next group to stumble upon the buried secrets. And deep in the pit of my stomach, I knew we weren't the first to hear those whispers, and we wouldn't be the last. Story 9. The sun had just begun to dip below the tree-line when we arrived at the campsite. The air was fresh, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. We were a group of 5, me, my best friend Kyle, his girlfriend Erin, and 2 other friends, Jake and Claire. The perfect crowd for a weekend in the woods, away from the noise of the city. I had been looking forward to this for months. A chance to escape, to clear my head. I had no idea then how little I actually wanted peace. The campsite was quiet, tucked away in the corner of Blackwater Forest, far from any hiking trails or popular spots. The map we had from the ranger station didn't even show this place. But the trees were dense, and the silence was so thick that it felt like the forest had swallowed all the noise of the world. We set up our tents, started a fire, and joked about the usual camping stuff. The cold, the lack of reception, and the stories of bears and mountain lions that we told to spook each other. It was during that first night, after we'd eaten dinner and the sky had darkened completely, that I first noticed him. We were sitting around the fire, the flames crackling as Kyle passed around the whiskey, and Erin started talking about ghosts. She had always been the skeptic of the group, dismissing the idea of anything supernatural. But tonight, there was a certain edge to her voice as she spoke, as if the idea of things lurking in the shadows wasn't so absurd after all. That's all nonsense, Erin said, laughing nervously as we passed the bottle between us. There's no such thing as ghosts. If anything haunts these woods, it's just bad weather. I was about to agree when my eyes caught something moving on the edge of the trees. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, my breath caught in my throat. A man, or what looked like a man, was standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. His clothes were tattered, frayed at the edges, like he had been wandering these woods for ages. But it wasn't his clothes that made my heart race. It was his face, or rather, the lack of it. Where his face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, as if his entire face had been erased. It was pale, almost sickly, and stretched tight over the contours of his skull. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just the blank, unblinking surface of his skin, catching the light of the fire. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was still there. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. He wasn't close, not really, but the way he stood there, motionless, was unnerving. He was watching us. I could feel it. "Hey guys," I said, my voice low. "Is anyone else seeing this?" They all turned to look, following my gaze. But when they looked at the edge of the trees, the man wasn't there anymore. The spot where he had been standing was empty. "I don't see anything, man," Kyle said, his voice tinged with amusement. "You're just spooked." But I knew what I'd seen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I'd seen. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself that it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But something in me knew better. Something told me that whatever I had seen wasn't just a trick. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me sit up in my tent, straining to hear. The wind through the trees, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of an owl. It all felt like it was just a backdrop to something else. Something watching. The next day, we went hiking. We covered several miles, following a narrow trail through thick woods, trying to shake off the unease of last night. But when we stopped for lunch near a creek, I couldn't help but feel like we were being followed. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind us. But when I turned, there was only the endless stretch of trees. The forest felt different somehow, alive in a way that I couldn't quite put into words. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed down on me. That night, we were sitting around the campfire again, a little more subdued. I couldn't help but keep glancing at the woods, waiting to see that figure again. Kyle was telling some ridiculous story about a ghost he'd heard about in a nearby town, but I wasn't really listening. I kept watching the edge of the trees, hoping I was imagining things. And then I saw him again. He was standing in the same spot, watching us. But this time he was closer than before. Not much, but enough that my heart skipped a beat. His face, or rather, the lack of it, was even more disturbing in the flickering firelight. The skin stretched tight over his skull, so smooth, so pale, it almost glowed. I froze, unable to look away. The others noticed me staring, and they followed my gaze. But once again, when they looked, the figure was gone. No rustling, no footsteps, just empty trees. "You're starting to freak me out, man," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Maybe you need some sleep." But I knew, deep down, I knew this wasn't just my imagination. This thing, whatever it was out there, watching us. The night dragged on, and sleep was impossible. Every rustle of the wind felt like footsteps. Every shadow in the trees looked like him. But he didn't come any closer, not until the last night. The fire was low, the night deepening. The others were all half asleep, their heads nodding, eyes heavy with the exhaustion of the last few days. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the woods. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he appeared, at the very edge of the firelight, standing motionless, his blank face turned toward us, his head tilted, as if listening, as if waiting for something. The air grew colder, the shadows around him darker, thicker. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He was so close now, too close. "Do you see him?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The others woke, startled, and looked. But when they saw him, they froze just like I had. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The man, or whatever he was, stood there, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if examining us, considering us. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, just like that, he was gone, disappeared back into the trees, without a sound. We packed up and left first thing in the morning, no questions asked. None of us wanted to speak of it. But as I looked over my shoulder one last time, I saw something. a figure standing in the woods just beyond the tree line. Its face, smooth, pale, featureless, staring back at me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't the last time we'd see him. Story 10. It started like any other camping trip. Just a bunch of old friends trying to relive the good times, escape the routine, and reconnect with nature. There were 5 of us. Me, Jake, Nora, Sam, and Alex. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, near a creek we'd all remembered from a childhood trip. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and isolated. The kind of place where the stars hung heavy in the sky, and the crackling of the fire seemed to be the only sound you could hear. We set up camp around the fire pit, laughing, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows. The night was crisp, the air filled with the earthy scent of pine. Everything felt right. But then, as the hours passed, something shifted. The laughter began to die down. The warmth from the fire faded. It was the kind of shift you feel in your gut but can't quite explain. I remember that moment when I looked up at the sky. The stars were so clear, so bright, like little pinpricks in the black velvet of the night. But something was off. The moon was full, its light casting long shadows across the ground. But the shadows didn't look right. They seemed to stretch, to move as though they were alive. It wasn't normal. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Eventually, the conversation died, and we all crawled into our tents. I fell asleep quickly, the soothing sounds of the forest wrapping around me. But I had an unsettling dream. It wasn't one of those dreams that made you wake up sweating. No, this one felt more like a memory, like I was reliving something that had happened long before I had ever stepped into these woods. In the dream, I saw trees, tall, twisted, and ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. But they weren't just trees. They were watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence heavy and suffocating. I heard whispers too, muffled, just out of reach. It was like the trees were trying to speak to me. I woke up at the start, my heart racing. The sun should have been rising, but the light outside was still dim, like the last vestiges of night were lingering. I glanced at my watch, 6:30 a.m. It was supposed to be light by now, but it wasn't. The forest was still dark, the air thick and cold. I unzipped the tent to check, hoping to see a sliver of sunlight peeking over the horizon. But there was nothing. The sky was still the same black blue it had been hours ago. I stepped outside, and that's when I felt it. Something was wrong. I looked over at the campfire. The embers were still glowing faintly, but there was no warmth to them anymore. The fire that had been crackling with life when we fell asleep now seemed almost lifeless, as though the flames had forgotten how to burn. And then I noticed something else, the silence. The birds had stopped singing. The rustling of leaves had ceased. It was as if the forest itself had held its breath. "Guys," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. I walked over to the other tents. Sam's tent was empty. Alex's was too. I knocked on Jake's tent, but there was no response. My stomach sank. I didn't know what to think. Maybe they'd all gone for a walk or something, but it didn't feel right. I wandered deeper into the woods, hoping to find them, but the more I walked, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. It was like they were leaning toward me, their branches stretching farther than they should, bending in unnatural directions. I started to feel like I was being guided, pushed towards something, but I couldn't see what it was. The path, which should have led me back to camp, seemed to twist and wind in ways that didn't make sense. I turned around several times, trying to retrace my steps, but every path led me back to where I started, our campsite. I felt a knot of panic begin to tighten in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. I could hear something in the distance. Voices, faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. But then they grew louder, clearer. They were coming from all around me, and they were unmistakably human. Stay with us. Don't leave. Please, just stay a little longer. I stopped dead in my tracks. The voices weren't coming from my friends. They were coming from the trees, from the shadows, from the very ground beneath my feet. I could feel them, their presence, like they were pressing in from all sides. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I turned around, ready to head back to camp, but the path had vanished. The forest had swallowed it whole. I ran. I don't know how long I ran or how far, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed me, a constant, nagging presence in my ears. My mind was screaming at me to get back to camp, to find my friends, but every direction I took led me nowhere. The woods felt endless, stretching on and on without end. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back into camp, if it could even be called that anymore. The fire pit was still there, but the fire was completely out, the stones cold and lifeless. My friends' tents were still standing, but the air had changed. It was suffocating now, heavy with an unseen weight. I called out again, but there was no answer. I could hear breathing, though deep, ragged breaths coming from somewhere in the trees. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, like something was watching me, waiting. I tried to shake it off, to believe that I was just imagining things, but then something shifted again. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and for a brief moment, I thought it was one of my friends. But then I saw its face, or rather, what was left of it. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones. The eyes were black pits, hollow and empty. Its mouth opened, and it whispered in a voice that made my blood run cold. Stay with us. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The thing took a step toward me, and then another, its feet barely touching the ground, like it was floating. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, disappearing into the trees. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, crawling under my skin. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. It felt like the woods had trapped me, like it was alive and it wanted me to stay. And then I realized something. There was no sun. The night wasn't ending. The darkness had taken hold, and it wasn't going to let go. The voices kept calling, softer now, like a lullaby. Stay with us. And no matter how hard I tried to leave, the forest always brought me back. The trees were too tall, the path too twisted. I was stuck in this never-ending night, and I couldn't escape. I don't know if anyone will ever find me, or if anyone even knows I'm here. All I know is that the night keeps stretching on, and the whispers never stop. Stay with us. Please stay. I'm not sure if I'm still alive. The air is so cold now, and my skin is numb, but I can't leave. And no matter how much I scream, no one is listening. I'm beginning to think that maybe I never will leave. The forest is alive, and it's hungry, and I'm its next meal.